Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something you might not have thought about too much when setting up your smart home.
Oh, yeah.
What happens when your automations go wrong,
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Like we set these automations up and then we kind of just expect them to run in the background.
right?
And there's this whole other side to it. Like what happens when they don't work,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and how do you even know if something's going wrong?
Yeah,
And then like how do you even make it more reliable?
totally.
So we've got some really interesting sources here that kind of dig into the less glamorous side of smart home automation,
Yeah,
the stuff that doesn't always work out.
I'm
right.
excited.
And you know what? Even the pros have to think about this
Oh,
stuff.
for sure.
So it doesn't matter if you're rocking like Apple Home or Google Home, or if you're more like a DIYer with Home Assistant.
hmm
This deep dive should give you a whole new perspective.
Absolutely. But
hmm
what I find really interesting is that this whole expectation that things should just work is
hmm
almost baked into how consumer tech is designed.
How
Like
so?
Yeah.
platforms like Apple Home, Google Home,
Yeah.
they're all about being easy to use,
Yeah.
but sometimes that means they're not very transparent about what's going on behind the scenes.
Right. You just get those nice, pretty interfaces and the simple setup wizards. And it's
Exactly.
like, oh, set it and forget it.
Yeah,
But what happens
Mm.
when something goes wrong behind the scenes?
right.
Do those platforms even tell you? Nope.
Yeah, that's a big difference with something like Home Assistant,
Okay.
which is really popular with people who like to tinker and
Mhm.
have a lot of control.
Right.
You see, Home Assistant is kind of like this central hub that
Okay.
connects all these different devices from different brands. Think of it like a universal translator for your smart home.
Yeah, something I actually really like about Home Assistant is that it actually tells you when devices go offline or unavailable. And because of that, you can actually create automations that account for these irregularities. So you could technically create like some kind of system to let you know that, hey, these devices went offline and you should do something about it.
Gotcha. So more control, more flexibility,
Yeah.
but potentially more things that could break.
Industrial control systems or building automation, we're constantly dealing with devices failing and software crashing.
Really?
We call these transient issues.
Transient
They
is
can be anything from a bad connection to a sensor just not working right.
so even with like all the professional grade equipment and all the expertise, things still go wrong. So
Totally.
this isn't just me with my like janky DIY setup at home.
Absolutely not. It happens to everyone. And that's why in those professional settings, monitoring is super important.
Okay.
Imagine a security system going offline
Yeah.
or a critical piece of equipment malfunctioning in a hospital.
Oh yeah, that's definitely, you're 100% correct. Even in like big corporations like Amazon, Microsoft, you name it, these tech companies have systems that will monitor like what's going on. So we know when devices go offline, when APIs go offline, and we get paged in the middle of the night if something
That
happens.
makes sense. Okay. So let's say I've got a simple motion activated light in my hallway.
Okay.
It seems pretty straightforward.
Right.
But what are some of the ways that could actually go wrong?
There are a lot of points of failure, even in a setup as simple as that.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, the motion sensor itself could fail.
Okay.
Maybe the batteries die.
Right.
Or there's some interference.
Uh-huh.
Then the message from the sensor to your hub might not get through because of network issues.
Oh, right.
And even if it does, the smart bulb itself could be offline or just malfunctioning.
So it's like this whole chain reaction.
Yeah.
One link breaks, and I might not even realize unless I walk down the hallway and the light isn't on.
Exactly. And it gets even trickier with things like door locks or security systems,
Right.
where you might not notice a failure until it's too late.
Oh, yeah. That's scary.
Okay, so then tell me, what's your suggestion for how to fix this?
That's a great question. And it leads us to the concept of alarming.
Alarming.
Yeah, in professional settings, alarming is all about having systems that kind of watch out for potential issues,
Okay.
and then they tell us about them before they become like major problems.
Gotcha.
You can think about like a really fancy early warning system.
So instead of waiting for something to break,
Right.
you've got systems that are always checking for any sign of trouble.
Exactly. We're monitoring key metrics.
Okay, that makes sense. So then I'm assuming with these key metrics, like what are you, what, how do you do with that? Like sure, I'm monitoring these key metrics, but how does that translate to alarming?
If a metric crosses a certain threshold,
Yeah.
boom, it's triggers an alert.
Are we talking about something that I could actually do in my own smart home?
Yeah, no, I agree with him. Like, is that something, should we even do this in our own smart home? Because it sounds like it's a lot of work and it's kind of tedious. Like, at what point should we consider doing something like this?
You can definitely apply these principles to your home setup.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, think about it. You probably already have some basic alerting in place. Like your security system might send you a notification if a door's left open,
Right.
or your smoke detector might go off if it senses smoke.
So this seems like we already doing like this metric alarming type of thing already with some of our automations. This concept seems like it shouldn't be too far from us from what we're already doing then.
Exactly.
So how do you decide what to monitor
Right.
and like what those thresholds should be?
That's a great question.
It seems like you could get overwhelmed with alerts pretty easily.
You could. That's why in professional settings, we categorize our alarms based on how critical they are.
Okay.
So like a non-critical alarm might just mean there's a minor issue that can be fixed later,
Uh-huh.
while a critical alarm means there's something serious going on.
Right. So it's like a triage system for your smart home.
Exactly.
You figure out which alerts need attention right away
Right.
and which ones can wait.
And the goal is to get the right amount of information.
So how would I go about setting something like that up?
Okay.
Do platforms like Apple Home or Google Home have those kind of alerting features?
They're getting better at it. They still focus more on being simple than giving you a ton of control.
Okay.
You might be able to set up basic notifications, like if a device goes offline,
Right.
but you won't get the same level of customization.
So if I want more control over my smart home's alerting home assistant is the way to go.
It's a great option if you're comfortable with a little bit more technical setup.
Okay.
Yeah, it can tell when a device goes offline,
Right.
which is a good place to start for an alerting system.
Uh-huh.
You can even create automations that do certain
Yes.
things based on those device states.
But it sounds like it takes some know-how to get that set up.
Well, technically, based off of what she mentioned, we're already doing this stuff within Home Assistant. Like you have access to the states of the devices, so we could just create automations that alert us when these things go offline. But there is another tool that I think can help called Node-RED.
What is that exactly, and how can it help with alerting?
So Node-RED is a visual programming tool.
Okay.
It lets you create flows that connect all your devices and services. It's like building a flow chart
Okay.
where you can lay out how your smart home should respond to things that happen. So instead of writing code, right?
I can just like drag and drop different blocks to make my automations.
Exactly. And one of the things that makes Node-RED so great for alerting and
Yeah.
how flexible it is,
Okay.
you can use it to create custom notifications, send alerts to different places, or
Okay.
even trigger really complex actions based on what kind of alert it is.
Can you give me like a real world example
Yeah.
of how I could use Node-RED to make my smart home's alerting better?
Sure. Let's go back to your motion activated light.
Seems pretty simple.
So let's say you want to make sure that that is truly reliable.
Yeah. How would we do that?
Now imagine using Node-RED to create a simple test that runs every night.
Okay.
And what it does is it virtually triggers the motion sensor.
Okay.
It basically simulates someone walking into the room.
So instead of me physically going in there every night to make sure it's working.
Exactly.
Okay.
Node-RED does it for us.
Gotcha.
And then it checks to see, did the light actually turn on?
Okay.
If it did, fantastic. Everything's working as expected.
Right.
But if it didn't,
Oh.
Node-RED could send you an alert
Okay.
letting you know, hey, something in that chain of actions failed.
Interesting. So instead of, waiting until I go into that room and I'm like, oh, why is it dark?
Right.
I already know, and I can go fix it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this is just one example. Let's say you have an automation that locks your door at a certain time.
Right.
You could use Node-RED to simulate that time passing
Okay.
and then check, did the door actually lock?
So we're kind of running through these scenarios in the background, making sure everything's happening as it should.
Right. And you can even schedule these tests to run at specific times or intervals.
Interesting.
So maybe you want to test your door lock every night before bed,
Yeah.
or check your security system every morning.
Facts. Those are facts. Yeah, definitely. Like you can use even Home Assistant to do the same thing. If you create an automation that is checking, let's say, when the motion sensor goes off and then turn on this light, you could have Home Assistant checking for the state of those particular entities, or even when you're running the automations, have like if else in the system to say that if it's offline, then do something else, or to let you know. Your automations do become more complex though. That's like the downside to it. So if you're using, let's say, Home Assistant and you want to do this type of checks, expect your automations to be more complex. Node-RED does help soften this out a bit because it allows you to like separate these things out into concerns, but still very, very powerful techniques.
Wow. This is making me realize there's a whole other level to this. But I have to admit, it also sounds a little intimidating.
Yeah.
Like, where do I even start?
Well, if you're looking to just understand a little bit more about, sorry, debugging and creating metrics around particular automations and like triggering off of it, there are some posts within the tech enthusiast community that talks about this.
That's good to know. It's always nice to have people to help you out when you're learning new stuff. Before we get too deep into the technical stuff, though,
Okay.
I want to step back for a second
Yeah.
and talk about the bigger picture.
Okay.
We've been talking about how important alerting and monitoring are,
Right.
but are there any downsides?
Mhm.
Are there any
good
trade-offs to be aware of?
question.
That's
Good
a great question. You definitely need to consider both sides.
Definitely.
Okay.
One potential downside is alert fatigue.
Alert fatigue.
Yeah, if you set up too many alerts.
Okay.
Or if your thresholds are too sensitive.
Yeah?
You could end up getting bombarded with notifications.
Right.
And that can get really annoying.
Yeah.
And then you might just start ignoring them altogether.
Yeah, don't most definitely. Like you're right on the money because like at Amazon, for instance, we monitor almost everything. When we create new services and APIs, like we're constantly monitoring to make sure that things are working the way that they should. But it can be tricky trying to figure out like what priority certain things should have. Like we know that when, let's say, one particular API goes down, it's considered, let's say, a SEV2, and these are things that will wake you up in the middle of the night to go and fix. But then you have smaller ones that are like SEV3s and SEV4s, which aren't that impactful, but they should be taken care of. But we get so much, like things happen all the time, so then we start to ignore it, and then it just kind of defeats the purpose a bit.
So it's like the boy who cried wolves.
Exactly.
You get too many alerts for small things.
Right.
And then you might miss a big one when it really matters.
Exactly. You got to find the right balance.
Another thing to think about is that setting up a really fancy alerting system takes time and effort.
Yeah.
You can't just set it and forget it.
It does take some ongoing attention.
That is also very true. I know for within the technical realm, we definitely have to set aside time to reevaluate whether or not these alarms are doing what they're supposed to do. As your system grows, as things become more complex or things get deprecated, certain alarms just aren't needed anymore. Certain things require new types of thresholds because things change. Things change constantly, so it just becomes another point to measure. But it raises the bigger question as to whether or not it's necessary. Like, do we need this level of transparency within our smart home? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. It's for us to kind of figure out.
This has been really eye-opening.
Good.
I'm starting to see why being more proactive is so important.
Yeah.
But realistically, not every automation needs this level of scrutiny, right?
Yeah, you raise a good point.
Like, I don't need to know if the light in my closet doesn't come on.
Exactly. So it's all about finding the right balance and prioritizing. Do you need to be alerted if the light in your guest room fails?
Probably not.
Maybe not.
But my security system, yeah. I want to know about that. Or my garage door.
What about the automation that controls your garage door?
Yeah, exactly.
Those are systems where reliability is paramount.
Okay, so it's really about identifying the ones that are most important to us
Exactly.
and kind of putting our focus there.
And remember, it's not an all or nothing proposition.
Sure.
You can start small,
Okay.
maybe pick one or two key automations,
Yeah.
gradually expand your testing and monitoring as you gain more experience and confidence.
I wonder, are there other benefits beyond just the reliability?
That's a great question. So beyond the peace of mind,
Yeah.
testing and monitoring can actually help you optimize your automations,
Okay.
understand how they're performing,
Right.
even identify areas for improvement.
Oh, so we can kind of use the data to make them better.
Exactly. It's about taking a more data-driven approach
Okay.
to your smart home.
So it's not just about catching failures, it's about making our systems even better.
Precisely. It's about taking a proactive approach
Right.
to smart home management
Okay.
and using data to make informed decisions.
Very cool.
And as we've discussed, with the right tools and a little bit of effort, it's something anyone can do.
But I'm curious about the future of smart home automation.
Okay.
How will AI and machine learning change how we think about alerting and monitoring?
I think that's a fair question. If we look at AI, right, it basically feeds itself off of text. Like you give it text and it interprets it and then gives you some output based off of that unstructured data. And these tests that we're running, these metrics, in a way, they're a bit unstructured, right? They tell us what's going on from a human perspective for those of us that can read it. And of course, we can put it into a form that machines can read it. For instance, some kind of configuration file like YAML or like JSON. But if we can feed this to AI can essentially recognize patterns and tell us, hey, these devices are working versus not working. This is the reliability of this or that. And I think it gives us a whole new dimension in understanding our smart
But I
home.
think for a lot of listeners, they're probably thinking, okay, this all sounds great, but where do I even start?
Right.
Are there other tools or resources people can use if they want to kind of get into this world?
Well, I'm going to keep it 100 with you. I have not heard anyone up until this point talk about metrics and alarming for automations. Typically, we just create our automations and we expect them to work. We don't expect them to fail. And even though we don't out loud expect them to fail, we know deep down and internally, those of us that are building it, we know that at some point they're going to fail for whatever reason. And we don't really have a good way of tracking or noting that unless we're looking at the dashboards or anything like that. And especially if you're using like Apple Home or any of these other systems, you're not going to get that information. So when it comes to like information out there that's talking about this, I don't really come across it often, or to be honest, at all at this point. Maybe there are some folks or some forums out there that do discuss this, but from bringing in the from the professional realm, like digging in from that arena, there are some things, some common patterns that I see that Home Assistant has that can be leveraged to utilize those techniques that I see in the professional settings. And if people are looking for these techniques or ideas, again, I mentioned earlier, the tech enthusiast community does have a few posts around this. If this is something that people want to get into, they can definitely post there in that community, and more information can be given. But this is a bit niche, and I would say it's for those that are really into creating a robust experience that is maintainable as well as a reliable. So I wouldn't do this every automation, as you rightly pointed out. Like, not everything needs to be tracked, but there are a few things that can be tracked. You know what? Here's a good example, right? Here's a story. So, my wife, she has a thing with our front door, right? So one of the automations that she particularly love is that the front door will lock itself because our family tends to forget to lock the door. So we created an automation that if the door is left unlocked, then it will lock itself after a few minutes. But then I took the liberties of extending that automation and creating a sister automation that will arm the house if no activity or phones are detected. So if our phones are not detected on the Wi-Fi, it will arm the house because no one is home. So technically the automation works fine, technically, but I've recognized that there were some transient issues, as was pointed out from earlier, where there are times when the Home Assistant kind of seen it as unknown or unresponsive. It just didn't track it that well. So we would be home, or at least one of us would be home, and the home couldn't see the phones. Even though they're connected to the Wi-Fi, there was some kind of gap or delay, something, not entirely sure. And it would start the arming sequence. And we have a 4-year-old daughter. She seemed to be traumatized by the loud piercing sound of the alarm. So whenever she hears that, doot, 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 like just counting down, just she screams and like puts her hands to her ears and she starts running. Even though it's not off, it's like you got a whole 60 seconds. She is just gunning it for the door and just screaming at the top of her lungs with her ears covered. So of course, this annoys my wife because, at this one point she was doing her hair and my child was eating pizza. So she had pizza fingers. And then that whole situation went off and she took her greasy hands and shoved it into her ears and into her hair. My wife was not happy about that. Not at all. But something like this, like as comical as it sounds, right? Having a system or having, a way to monitor the reliability of automations that are critical. So, for instance, arming the house is a critical automation. I would want to know when this is acting up, when things go offline, why they went offline. Like, these are things that you would want to know. I wouldn't have it for everything. I wouldn't have it for if, let's say, the dishwasher didn't, alert me when there's more dishwasher pods. But I would want to know when, like, the door isn't locking or when the alarm isn't going off or, things to that nature. But again, not to not to take over this podcast, uh, I would say that if you're looking for ideas, if you're looking for ways to implement more robust automations by including metrics, definitely head to the tech enthusiast community, and you're probably going to want to check out Node-RED. If you are unfamiliar with Node-RED, which I know many people are, there is a course within the tech enthusiast community that you could use, and it will walk you through from a beginner level to how you can use it. And by the end of that course, you're gonna know how to use Node-RED, and it's meant for Home Assistant users and beginners, like beginning Home Assistant users. So even if you have a decent level of Home Assistant experience, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine with this. Just check the show notes or the link in the description, and you'll find links to take you to the community.
Well said.
Yeah,
I think we've given everyone a lot to think about
I think so.
and a lot to do, but hopefully in a way that is exciting and not overwhelming.
Absolutely.
So to all of our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep learning, keep experimenting, and keep pushing those limits.
Yeah, have fun with it.
It's exactly. The possibilities really are endless.
They are.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into reliable smart home automations.